cheating isn't acceptable. Okay, everybody, good afternoon. So how is everyone doing today? Thumbs up from Ashley, that's good. So I'm having some issues, but I think I can do class today, so we'll try and make it work. Um, so before I forget, just don't forget that tomorrow you've got an assignment that's due. It's a pick and dive, which is a strange phrase, but I'm asking you to choose a topic from the reading that's due for today that interests you, and just go do some internet research on it. Go look at Wikipedia and Google and um, follow the path down the rabbit hole and see what comes up, and then a very short, relatively informal summary of what you found about this thing that you didn't know about before. So that's due tomorrow for discussion sections. Other updates. Um, we're grading SA2s. I think your grades are going to be appearing, over the next several days on Moodle. So have a look at that, and as well as your graded essays. Overall, I think that my batch, the students, did pretty well on that. A lot of students who were, in sort of the not satisfactory range did a better job. So I was really happy to see that. So look for those grades very soon. So for last class, I couldn't be here in person. I asked you to watch a video, a recorded lecture from the past. I'm going to try not to go over too much of that material again today. I'm going to sort of talk about new stuff today, but I want to make sure we bring some of that with us forward. Does anybody have any questions about Tuesday's non-lecture or other stuff? I saw a question in the chat about pick and yeah, so there will be a folder for pick and dive on Moodle. Yes, Ellie, that will be there. So if we can, kind of, the election's going on. We're still counting votes. We're still trying to just hold on and hold our breath. So we will see what happens with that. But let's talk about Japan in the post-war period and how it has gone through so many amazing transformations in a very short amount of time, yet again, under the occupation and afterwards. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen with you. And this will work, okay. Okay. So as I mentioned in the recorded lecture that you hopefully got a chance to look at, and as you get to read about also in Gordon, the occupation it has a sort of a big mandate to fulfill, and we talked about the Constitution being rewritten and just the great changes that were happening to make Japan into a different kind of country, great in terms of size, not good. And one of the things that I want to talk about, I want to retouch upon again today is that the sort of choices the occupation made. First of all, the occupation chose not to prosecute the emperor. And the picture here that we talked about, as sort of epitomizing the power differential between Emperor Hirohito and General MacArthur. It does that, but it also is sort of a commitment to protect the emperor, which may not have been foreseeable originally. And so the emperor is not prosecuted, he is not implicated, he is not held accountable for all of the things that the Japanese will be judged for in the international court. And this is an interesting decision. The choice was made, I think, mostly to try and to maintain some stability and continuity for people that had gone through such a difficult time. The other important thing that I think I sort of want to reiterate is that Yasukuni Shrine, this center for state Shinto and for civil national religion that promoted emperor worship and militarism, and was state funded. In fact, was military funded by the Navy. This shrine is allowed to stay standing. It's not torn down. It's not disestablished, and it's still there today. And as we'll see in a couple classes, this is one of the things that will remain a difficult point for Japan's neighbors moving forward. And the choice again here was largely informed by asking a lot of good questions. The occupation asked a lot of experts, both Japanese experts of religion, as well as Western experts of Japanese religion, for their point of view. And to make a long story sort of very short, it was actually American Catholic priests and missionaries, along with Japanese religious scholars, who agreed that Yasukuni should be saved. And so, although it was sort of on the docket to be probably dismantled, it was saved in 1951 before the end of the occupation by SCAP. So while those two things do stay, so much does go, right? And as I mentioned in what you got to watch, hopefully on Tuesday, many people working in business, in industries, and in the government are purged in the first 3 years of the occupation. State Shinto is dissolved and disestablished. I mentioned the emperor doesn't have to go away, but the higher police that was so important in trying to promote ideological conformity and punish dissent is disbanded and outlawed. The biggest zaibatsus, the sort of the machines that made military machine work and that gave it its supplies, it's dissolved. Many of them are dissolved. At their core, the holding company at the center of the zaibatsu, and the biggest companies, Mitsui, Mitsubishi, are forced to divide up into smaller companies. So these are important changes. The military of Japan also, on Article 9, is officially dissolved and never re-established as such. And thinking about, I wanted just to clarify something that I'm not sure I made it clear. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East is committed to bringing the Japanese to justice for their war crimes. And this is, the Allied Far Eastern Commission of 10 Nations that we talked about 2 classes ago, who are going to preside over this trial. This is a big deal. The world actually watches this or reads about it or hears it on the radio. It's really quite a big deal. But I wanted to highlight that sort of what these categories mean. So there are 3 categories of war crimes in the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. And Class A are crimes against peace. So this means the intent to wage war, to break international conventions in order to do so. And so, this is where we see like a general or an admiral or those high-ranking officers who really tried to make war happen. But there also are conventional war crimes, such as shooting an unarmed civilian. This is a conventional war crime. It's a Class B war crime. Many of them who were charged with Class A war crimes were also charged with Class B or Class C war crimes as well. Class C war crimes are crimes against humanity. These are things like the Nanjing massacre, things that that in terms of scale, right, take war crimes to a much larger level, to either sort of a genocidal level or some sort of a larger level, but of the same kinds of horrible atrocities. So these things, Japan answers for them before the tribunal. Tojo is found guilty, who we see here, but many others are as well, and their imprisonments as well as executions of these figures. But Japan is not forced to sort of stay in that position. From 1949, SCAP really sort of turns the corner in trying to think about how to help Japan to rebuild. The Dodge Plan, which I mentioned in the last class on Tuesday as well, is a big part of that. It's somewhat similar to like the Marshall Plan in Western Europe, in Germany, I should say. The US at the head of the occupation, at the head of SCAP, wants to make Japan into a strong bulwark against, a strong ally for the U.S. in Asia. The Dodge Plan is put together and announced by a banker named Joe Dodge from Detroit, and he brought his experience from Germany, West Germany, I should say, over to Japan and had the same kind of fiscal policies, and so he steps in and begins to put these changes in place. Many of the people who will lead Japan after the occupation is over began their post-war careers working in the various parts of government that were being remade under Joseph Dodge, including future Prime Minister Hayato Ikeda. Ikeda Hayato. So he was promoting more taxes, right, and less spending, promoting subsidies to manufacturers so they could get that important sector of their economy going again, promoting a lot less spending on sort of the socialistic kind of approach that was in place before welfare, education, public works. People were being asked on an individual level to consume less, and Japan was hopefully going to be able to export more. And they also fix a new US dollar yen exchange rate, which will help the economy as well to stabilize itself. So all of these things are important. And I'm not going to go into the last part because it's not really important for our talk today, but I'll just sort of highlight that the result of this discourse is that a lot of these policies in the short term make it very hard to work, to live, to survive in Japan. They don't stop by any means during that first couple of years, the suffering and the blue sky markets and then the poverty. But in the end, they do create foundations for growth in the future. So the Dodge plan is sort of like a kickstart to the Japanese economy, although it takes, I would say, a couple of years before it really begins to show dividends, partially because the other important kickstarting element takes place, and that's the Korean War. We talked about the reverse course during the video that hopefully you got a chance to watch on Tuesday. This is, a total about face for the United States and for the occupation authorities. They want to see Japan as a bulwark against communism, and they want to see Japan having enough of a control over its citizens so that they will not veer too far to the left, and they will not embrace communism, and they will not, embrace alliances with communist nations like China, declared in 1949, PRC, and with obviously the Soviet Union. And so right afterwards, right in 1950, the U.S. Gets into the Korean War. This is we can't go on it again for sake of time into huge detail. Korean War is a war that I mentioned, I think maybe last class on Tuesday. I can't remember if that's something or not, but it's a war between basically two different parts of Korea that are fighting and trying to determine whether Korea will unite and become a communist state or communistic state allied to the Soviet Union, or become a U.S. allied capitalist state. And it's really very clearly divided. People actually leave the North. People who were sort of collaborative with the Japanese or who were capitalistic, they leave the North to come to the South, and vice versa. People from the South move north, seeking a more sort of socialistic approach to government. And we also see that this both groups want to see the country united. And in this case, the U.S. forces go and are going to try and support the South Korean, the Republic of Korea forces as they try and unite the country again. And the platform for this, right, the launching point for the U.S. offensive in South Korea, eventually North Korea as they move on, is going to be, in fact, Japan. And Japan's exports are going to skyrocket because of the demand for munitions and materials and weapons and industrial products through this war. And the war kind of continues, and it's actually a war that has not officially been ended to this day with an official end to the war, but it is a war that comes to a stalemate in which the all parties decide to stop fighting and to divide Korea between the North and the South along the 38th parallel, which we see here, the so-called DMZ, or demilitarized zone. So I mentioned this a little bit, within the sort of the frame of this collaboration with the United States, Japan suddenly gets just a huge windfall of sort of, technological and economic support to help the U.S. fight this war and fight communism. And so in addition to all the orders, right, for materials, they also are going to get a lot of technological upgrades on their own, on their industries. They're going to get first look at a lot of cutting edge US technologies. And we're going to see also people getting back into industrial jobs, because there are industries and factories that are now working in large part to support this war effort. And then we're also going to see the exports just, just again, go out the roof. The sort of next, perhaps most important and sort of the next chronologically speaking step in this process, right, moving from the reverse course to the Dodge Plan, Korean War, is the San Francisco system, which actually ends the occupation, but does so on a foundation that's going to allow Japan to be a strong and relatively obedient U.S. ally. So what is this system? Let's talk about that really briefly here. So it commits the world, it commits the United States to recognizing the end of the war for Japan. There will be no more needs beyond this for reparations or other things from the United States or the Allied forces, Allied powers, I should say, tied to the war. 48 nations are going to sign this to end the war. And does commit Japan to a pretty big package of reparations, but in speaking generally, this is actually it's a nice way to end things, at least. It's some closure. And so in San Francisco, the new prime minister, who's been prime minister for only a short time, who we see here, his name is Yoshida Shigeru, he signs this, and this will, and in the back we can see American diplomats and presidents and all that in the back. But this signature means that Japan agrees to pay this, but also is looking to move forward, right, and to have a different role in the international order, a new role, a better role, a more positive role. Just afterwards, the U.S. and Japan in the same city will sign the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. This treaty is unlike the war-ending treaty in San Francisco. This is a treaty between U.S. and Japan, and this is what sets Japan on this new path to being a staunch U.S. ally. Japan is going to be free to develop economically, and Japan commits to follow the U.S. lead in international relations. And this is a really important point, as you can imagine. But the U.S. is going to be able to keep and actually, for the short term, expand base presence of the military in Japan to help the U.S.'s efforts, against and sort of the U.S.'s military presence in East Asia, and they're not really there to look after Japan anymore. They're there to protect Japan from any countries that might choose to attack it in order to get back at the U.S. As well, or so the rhetoric goes. So the military leaves 100,000 servicemen and women on bases, and these soldiers are still actually protected by the rule of extraterritoriality, which gives them the right, as you recall from our other, the last U.S.-Japan treaty, the Treaty of Amity and Commerce, to be tried by laws of their own country, in this case, the military law of the United States. And they also agreed to keep Okinawa as an entirely U.S. Military, controlled by U.S. military until '72. So they will stay there, and they will, in fact, have control over the entire island system of Okinawa for the next almost 20 years. So what happens is that these foundations really give Japan an unprecedented access to the benefits of being modern and technologically advanced, and having the economic influx from the United States and investment and of industrial requests and purchases, but also of not having to spend money on their military, and also of sort of not being allowed to, I should say, to develop their military. I mentioned the self-defense forces, I think hopefully on the Tuesday lecture that you got a chance to watch. It's part of the reverse course, but it's not an active military, right? They're not going to go in Star Wars or fight wars. And so even being as large as it is, it's still extremely less expensive than having an active military. And so this chart here really gives you a sense of Japan taking off, right, in the post-war period. The war here is a big dip for most countries that are on this graph, but what we see here is that Japan begins very low here and just propels itself through the stratosphere in terms of its economic growth over the next 50 years. So what does that look like? It looks like 10% annual growth in GDP and GNP. I'm not a math guy, I'm not an econ guy, but I think that those of you who do understand these terms appreciate it. But I mean, for any country, this is an unparalleled amount of growth. And every year for 23 years, they have this amount of growth. So the economy of Japan is just, it's getting larger and larger and larger. This, Japan today is, most would say about the third economy in the world. And this really begins during this time period. The GNP also doubles quickly in a very short period of time between 50 and 55, which again is a very impressive marker of development. And then it dual decoupled, overall, if we look from the beginning to the end. So this is just this massive growth. And this is in sectors, across the board from, industrial sectors, but also agriculture is doing quite well. And so, as a whole, the country is just, doing very well, making it the third largest economy in the world. At some points, China at this point had not gotten quite so large yet. It was second. But anyway, I'm going to keep moving on. So at the heart of this development is a pretty interesting organization called the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, or MITI, or MITI. It's changed names recently, but for our class, up until like the 2000s, this is the sort of the core to this development. So this is actually a trans-war institution that began in the Ministry of Commerce and Industry before, and then Ministry of Munitions, and it sort of carries on in a different form in the post-war period. And this institution, right, is a ministry that is its entire goal is to develop Japan's economy, but in a very sort of dynamic and purposeful way. So, they have a couple of different important trademarks that I want to highlight. One is that they want to promote industrial policy, which is a way of talking about trying to get to sort of be strategic. So they're going to get licensing for technologies from the United States in particular, but also some other countries as well. And they're going to choose who to give those to, right? Which industries need these licenses, which companies are best suited and best equipped to maximize their output and their revenue on that particular item, and discourage other industries. The car industry was a quick receiver of this kind of favoritism, but the industry of motorcycles was not. So we see it was very purposeful in that sense. And they also would like to give tax breaks and low rate loans to industries that need to grow and that have an importance in terms of sort of their strategic importance to Japan. And then we also see them using tariffs to try and protect those industries that they want to allow to grow. So these are important and very effective strategies that push certain industries in Japan to grow, but also to become world leaders. Administrative guidance is another one of their techniques, and this is more about how do you make, how do you sort of overall supervise and oversee a sector of the economy and sort of micromanage it so that it maximizes its capacity. And so what we see is, instead of allowing one company to in one industry to have monopoly or to buy others, we see the MITI stepping in and forcing different companies to work together and share technology, so that each of the companies together can sort of contribute to this larger growth of the industry. And we also see them, trying to encourage or discourage production based upon, the needs of that industry. So if there's a glut, there's too much of a certain product, MITI steps in and suppresses that production until it gets to a point where there will be enough demand to outweigh the supply. So, very purposeful, important things. And, in addition to that, companies are going to be seeing an important transition, as a lot of the most important businessmen of Japan, because they were actually all men in this case, were purged during the initial purge in 48. And many of them were old enough to retire afterwards and not go back to work. So what we see is sort of this new sort of middle management level of worker, entrepreneur, or manager who has now the opportunity to step up in Mitsubishi or Mitsui, which now are several different companies, but they're able to step up in their companies and to negotiate and communicate with MITI in order to make their name, but also to thrive. And I want to highlight a couple of different names here, just briefly, that you probably know. Excuse me. Because they are quite ubiquitous, worldwide today. Let's talk first about Toyota Kiichiro. So Toyota Kiichiro in the pre-war period was the owner of a loom company that they had really great machinery to do weaving. But from the early 30s, he began to shift gears to use this technology to have big machines that did other things. And so he was exporting to the US and to Europe. And then in the 30s, the Japanese military began to invest in his company and buy, not only textiles, but other things as well that he could produce with his increasingly diverse range of machinery. He began producing cars in the early 30s, and this is what eventually will definitely sort of become the most important technology of the Toyota brand. And he does well, and then the war happens, and he wasn't a major supplier of it for the military, so he actually doesn't do very well. After the war, he's actually not imprisoned or purged, and he in fact goes into a pretty difficult decline, nearing bankruptcy for the first part of the occupation. But the Korean War appears, and the United States, having already had his number from before the war and known him as someone his factories did a good job, they commissioned military vehicles for the for the U.S. military. And this provides sort of like the base upon which today's modern Toyota is founded, right? From the end of the Korean War, he's able to mass produce and mass market and then sell Toyota vehicles throughout the world, especially in Asia and North America. And that this will create, this will sort of create his place in the international market as a premier, not him, but his company, a premier car making, truck making, manufacturing company. This is Toyota today. Let's talk about Honda. So Honda Soichiro, who we see here. Another important figure, somewhat of a similar story. He had a company that made pistons for, piston rings, a particular thing, for vehicles. So he's making piston rings for Toyota Motors. He was like a subcontractor factory. His plant was actually bombed in 44, and then he had some leftover materials, which he actually sold to Toyota because there was no more use for him to have this bombed out plant. But he used the money that he invested in this, that he got from the sale, to create the Honda Technical Research Institute, which is actually, sorry, Denny. So the U.S. Bombed the plant. Good question. So this was his sort of like a garage, the big garage, where he invested this money in being able to develop technologies that he could use for his dream, which was to make motorized bicycles. he had a dream of that, and he thought it was going to be a real positive endeavor, and he got to work on that. And the first motorized bicycle that his institute created was in '48, and it was a smash hit. And the first motorcycles were produced in '49. And right away, this was actually the first Japanese motorcycle, the first exported Japanese motorcycle, and it would sell overseas, right away, better than Harleys and Triumph motorcycles. And so before Honda was making cars, they were making motorcycles, and they were doing so really well. And as I mentioned before, he's one of the people that was discouraged from doing this by the government. So that's why he had to use his own money to start this institute. But as he proved, he was perhaps smarter than Miti in this instance. Let's talk lastly about Sony. Sony is a company that was founded by two men, Ibuka Masaru and Morita Akio, who were actually both in the military together, and they were both also, in the engineering and physics realms. They were, and so they were friends. And then eventually, Ibuka had an idea to try his hand after the war in the realm of electronics. And it's actually a really interesting story as well. So basically, he had like a bombed out hangar that he was able to get for cheap. And they began to try and build, he began to build some small electronics. And then his friend came to join him after about a year, I think it was. And then as their enterprise got larger and larger, they were able to convince Miti to allow them to expand. And so they began to bring over, they get the right to use the license for a lot of cutting edge American technologies. In '50, they create the first tape recorder in Japan, which is a big deal. But the biggest acquisition for them is the transistor license, which they get from Bell Labs, which you probably know from Bell Telephone. They had created and perfected a transistor license, and Sony gets the company Sony gets the right to reproduce and use this patent, or this license, I should say, to make transistor technologies. It takes a while, but eventually this is kind of how they move from big things like radios to smaller ones. And by '79, they're able to develop, here they are. There's also a book called Made in Japan that Morita Akio wrote that talks about management. He was also very influential in the world of thinking about management differently in production. But anyway, in '79, they create the Walkman. Can you guys see that? Not sure why it's down there, but the Walkman. And this is the first handheld radio device that has headphones. It's very compact and it's very attractive, and it changes the world, right? So if you think about, your life today and how you like to have maybe your iPod, or you like to have like there's a thing called a Mighty that exists today that does music, or whatever you might have that carries music around with you. It all begins with these two visionary engineers and their efforts, and and the U.S. help to make this happen. And it was a very big success as well. Let's talk about what's happening elsewhere. So even though we have people like this who are the epitome of the post-war miracle, and who drove with their innovation and their efforts, the country as a whole goes through a big change as well. And a lot of those are tied to education. So I want to talk about education briefly next. The Japanese, as we talked about before, right, are a very highly educated population, and that's one of the sort of their trademarks, or their hallmarks, I should say, or their sort of defining characteristics. But in the aftermath of the war, the educational shape of the education for Japan is gonna have to go through some changes, and it's not sure how it's going to come out. what's going to look like. Um, I see that Eamon has asked, is anyone still using an iPod? That's probably, you're probably not. That's a good point. Let me perhaps point to like the cell phone, right, which has the same technologies today, and which can all again be traced back to the technologies that were being put into the Walkman. So anyway, let's go about education a little bit. The Occupation Authorities, actually, one of the SCAP sections is going to be dedicated to education, and they, with Japanese politicians, are going to develop a new education system that is still in place today for Japan. It's going to have 9 years of education that are mandatory, and including 6 years of primary school education, and 3 years of lower secondary school education as well. And then if you choose to go on, you can go to upper secondary school education as well. So going sort of to high school and then higher school, and then on to college. The biggest change in this new era is the obligation that schools would be co-ed. All public schools have to be co-educational. This is, in the US at this point, there's no co-education. Harvard University wasn't co-ed until the 70s. So this is actually another example of the US advisors imposing even more liberal policies in Japan than they did in the US, or than were around the US. There are still some girls' schools that only allow girls, but aside from those very specific handful of schools, co-education becomes the norm. And I also wanted to talk a bit about how they did this, right? They didn't have enough money for the first 5 years here, maybe 6 years to fund education in Japan the way that they would have liked to. The occupation didn't make money rain down from the sky to be able to support education. So how did they do it? And a lot of it has to do with recycling. They used buildings that had been destroyed, and they fixed them up to be schools again. And this is all over the country. One of the things that is interesting is the sort of, how are they going to get knowledge to children without a structure to provide textbooks, and faculty to write textbooks and those kinds of things. And the short-term solution for the first several years actually was to use pre-war textbooks. Of course, those textbooks were filled with things that the occupation thought were offensive or dangerous in terms of ideology. So how did they do it? Well, they used Suminori Kyokasho, which look like this. So they would actually go through and cross out materials that the occupation thought were not appropriate, and then they would use old textbooks for the learning. So this is how even in the post-war period, the pre-war ideas are actually going to transfer and still be around, hopefully minus the most problematic ones in Japan. One of the important changes also has to do with sort of how connecting high schools to universities and making that transition. And this is also partially continuity from the pre-war period, but it's also a big change. So, in the post-war system, everyone goes to high school. Which is unlike the pre-war system in that sense. And so now everybody is in high school. They want the desire to go to college is quite strong. The demand for college is quite strong. And so what we see is a need to be very selective if you have a good university about who gets in, because there's a huge demand. How do you choose? And so especially universities like Keio University, which was founded by Fukuzawa Yukichi, or Waseda University, which was founded by Okuma Shigenobu, or Tokyo University, or Osaka University, these imperial universities. These universities they're going to begin using very strict and thorough exams to weed out students. So the best students are the ones that are able to pass this exam and then be admitted to these schools. And so from the 80s, there's a new, because there's so much demand, there's a new institution that develops called the Juku, or the cram school. This is a very famous one called, excuse me, Yoyogi Seminar. and it's in Yoyogi, and they're expensive, and you pay, and you work with tutors to help you to ace these exams. And so what we see is that the economic investment in education, although actually originally isn't actually very expensive, is very high. And the pressure on children to go even from middle school to these cram schools to do well so that they can then go to these great schools is also very high. And to make things worse, um, if a student applies to a school, this is actually changing today, but if you apply to a school that is above, well, that's very, let's say it's out of your league, and you're unable to pass the test, then you're kind of left with the need to apply again the next year to that school or a different school. And so we have students who are stuck in limbo here, and they call them ronin because they're unable to, get into that educational and later career track. But once you do get into that career track, things can be quite impressive. And I'll get back to that in a second. So let's talk a bit about the population of Japan before I go back to education. The population of Japan reaches a relatively low sort of nadir after the war, but the first decade after the war, especially from 1949 or so to 55, is one of a lot of population growth. People are again having children, and this is a big demographic change for Japan. And unlike in the pre-war period, where there was some balance between rural and urban, the boom is going to be mostly urban, and that's going to continue to be the case for the rest of Japan's modern history. We also see that the creation of infrastructure to allow people to move around Japan is going to change dramatically in the post-war period. Paved roads were not a priority for most of Japan before the war, and because of all the destruction that was even less paved roads in 46 than in 45. But by 1980, about half the roads in Japan are paved, even on small, single lane roads, the 30-kilometer-per-hour sign, the roads are paved and with good material, so that even in the rain, you won't slip off the road. So this is, again, a big change in how the country is going to be connected together. So what we see is that even places that are a little bit further out from the urban areas are closely tied to the urban areas by these roads, and then even more, and also by trains. And this becomes even more true, perhaps even like exponentially so, with the creation of the Shinkansen. The Shinkansen is the bullet train, which is a technological marvel that Japan's engineers were able to develop over the course of the early 60s, and to unveil. The first one for Tokyo to Osaka, today's Nozomi line, took 3 hours, whereas before a train ride would take 8 hours to get from one to the other. This also is going to make it possible to work in these urban areas and not to drive, but to take the train and to get there faster. And so we see suburbs just explode in Japan. And this is, and we also see companies, sometimes also government institutions, creating apartments for mostly men working in major urban areas, but living in the suburbs. And this comes to define Japanese culture. Also comes to define, obviously, things like the home dynamics, or the family dynamics, the gender dynamics. All these kinds of things are going to be influenced by this development as well. I think that we don't have a lot of time, so I won't go through this with you too much. I'd like to show you a video, but I can't. But if you have time, just go on Google and type, like Shinkansen window ride. You can just see what it looks like. It's a beautiful, very calming experience. I would urge you to do it. And it really allows you also to see just how populous Japan is, because as you leave, for example, this is Shinagawa station here, I think. As you leave, there are fewer and fewer skyscrapers, and right away you're in the countryside, but it's still very developed. There's still buildings and there's still people all the time in these areas. So this is one of my favorite stations in Tokyo. It's called Hikarigaoka Station, and it's up and pretty far west of Shinjuku. But this is a station that I think embodies also what happens to Japan in the aftermath of the Shinkansen. What happens is that around these train stations, a whole sort of like biome develops with restaurants and stores and services. The post office will be there as well. So you have sort of people living in their suburban homes, and then you have these mega centers like this, kind of like a city, all by itself, built around the train station, with several different levels and different kinds of trains. This again is also an important part that defines the Japanese urban landscape today, as well as these sort of semi-urban landscapes. Even if you go to the countryside, you may find yourself looking at a big station like this. This is a danchi that I mentioned before, that are going to be housing mostly men who are working in bigger cities from the 60s, with usually pretty affordable housing. So that there's that. But as you can see around, it's very undeveloped in this non-urban area. The salaryman who works in the big city, Osaka, Fukuoka, some except Kyoto, but most likely, Kobe or Tokyo, these men are going to be working for these companies, and the way to get to these jobs is again through these elite universities, right? And when they have these jobs, they're going to have these jobs for life, which is a development that actually can be traced back to the 20s and the 30s. But this is a new modern era of the nuclear family tied to the city with trains. And what we see is the salarymen are torn. They have to actually, be in the city and have to do their job. And they also are oftentimes encouraged very strongly to take part in after work activities with their coworkers at bars and izakaya and restaurants. And one of the things that happens is, of course, they're not home very much. When they get home, it's very late. And this, as I mentioned before, leads to a very imbalanced dynamic of household labor and of gender. But it also leads to, I think, some pretty interesting, sometimes funny scenes. Salarymen drink a lot, and you will see them oftentimes in Japan having finished drinking too much and wearing the iconic salaryman overly nice suits, but looking very disheveled or sometimes drunk, like this guy here on the street. On the subway, people are quite used to it. Here's someone who obviously has had too much to drink and is asleep, and probably should go home, but has not yet. He may even be on the train from the day before, which is actually a pretty common thing as well. So I think that we're kind of close to the end of time. So I'll just briefly mention that the new post-war governments are very interested in women and how they can continue to help Japan to thrive. They want women to be working in the home. That's one of the policy sort of goals that they will have until the 80s. And even then, the changes are not very substantial. But in the home, they see women as sort of the front line to be the ones to help Japan to turn their finances into savings that can help Japan to become a stronger country. The new life movement of the 60s in particular, excuse me, of the 50s and 60s is going to be sort of carrying this particular torch. And that we'll be talking about how one can in their household continue to be efficient and use some of the household science, technology, and ideas from the pre-war period. But now they have new things like birth control that's available and being advocated, and they also have a chance to organize together. So actually the 60s is actually a time for women to actually organize quite a bit, even as mothers, and create national organizations that are sometimes influential. Perhaps another crowning achievement of the early post-war Japanese miracle and its rebirth is the Olympics of '64, which take place in Tokyo. If you read in the book, you may have noticed that they were supposed to be in 1940, the Olympic Games in Tokyo, but they were canceled. And now they were held in Tokyo. And this was Japan's chance to announce to the world that they had indeed arrived as a post-war, modern, pacifist, and economically successful nation. It's the first time there was a non-Western country hosting the Olympics, which is a big deal. Torchbearer was Saka Yoshinori, who we see here, who was born on the day of the bombing of Hiroshima, and who was therefore like sort of a symbolically important person to be carrying the torch for Japan. On top of that, the Japanese actually did really well, right? They won gold medals in wrestling and also in women's volleyball. Here we see them celebrating with their coach. So, Japan went through this tremendous amount of change, so much imposed by the occupation. And then there was another change where the occupation decided that they needed to be anti-communist and capitalistic, and they needed to be more conservative and have a self-defense force and all of these things. But among, in throughout all of that, they continue to improve and to grow and find their footing. So that by 1964, with their Shinkansen, which is imitated, in France and other parts of the world, but also the Olympics, and with so much more technology that's being also used overseas by Sony and Honda and Toyota and all those things, they have become a national player by that point. So we'll continue to follow Japan's rise. Next class. Thank you guys for listening, and have an excellent rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Have a nice weekend.
Professor Washington, can I ask you a question?
Sure, Naya.
Okay.
Stop the recording.